Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on India's national television channel Doordarshan about India's foreign policy, India's international relations, and key developments in important regions and sub-regions of the world that have a bearing on India's rise. Viewers, in this episode, we are doing a deep dive into security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region. This vast oceanic expanse stretching across multiple continents has the potential to remake the world order. India is a very central and pivotal player in the Indo-Pacific, but it's also a very contested region with lots of rivalries, conflicts, and tensions. So we're going to be looking at this region in its entirety, the important players, the protagonists, the antagonists, and also what this means going into the future for India and its rising position in the world. And to discuss this important theme, I have with me in the studio a well-regarded scholar and expert on these issues, Derek Grossman. Derek Grossman is a senior defense analyst at the RAND Corporation, an important American think tank headquartered in California, and has been writing and leading the thought as well as the action and policies on Indo-Pacific developments for a long time. Derek, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thanks for having me.
Derek, let's start with the state of play in this region, which you study and analyze so closely. The concept of Indo-Pacific has been there for around a decade now, and it has increasingly come into vogue. But still, as I said in the introduction, it's contested, and there are lots of players who don't even accept the terminology Indo-Pacific, and they're trying to actually resist the development of Indo-Pacific regional architecture. I refer, of course, to China, but there are others who think that this concept is useful. So let's begin with what you think is the overall balance of power and what is the current state of play in the region before we go further into individual actors.
Sure. Well, so the Indo-Pacific as a strategy came from the first Trump administration. And the idea was to empower countries that are island states as well as maritime rim countries along the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Oceans to work together with the United States to help counter China. And so when you talk about, well, there are countries who may not share the US's view of the Indo-Pacific, well, one of those countries is certainly China itself, because they believe that the United States is strengthening alliances and partnerships throughout the region, both on the Pacific Ocean side and the Indian Ocean side, to include with India. The Chinese believe that the US is doing that in order to not just counter China, but to contain China, to keep China down militarily, economically, and politically. And the reality of the situation is, I think that the United States is not necessarily trying to contain China, but is certainly competing against China to prevent it from coercing countries within the region and preventing it from being a free and open, in the Trump and Biden administration's terminology, a free and open region.
Right. And Derek, talking of China, I mean, we've all been following their responses to the big election in the US and the return of Donald Trump. And they are saying, on the basis of mutual respect, we can peacefully coexist. But this competition that you're talking about, if not containment, is certainly something that does not suggest that there's mutual respect, but there's more of a rivalry between the two great powers. This great power competition is in many ways defining the Indo-Pacific, right, or setting the stage for all the other players to accommodate and adjust. So do you think the second Trump administration is going to try and tighten the screws and to be harsher or more assertive in terms of pushing back the Chinese expansionism? And some of the nominees that are being talked about for the Trump administration do suggest that there are going to be a lot of China hawks from 2025 in Washington. So in that context, is this rivalry going to get hotter, you think, or are there going to be breaks, or are there going to be contradictions in this rivalry? What is your overall assessment of the great power tussle there?
Well, so what we've seen so far in Trump's picks for key positions like Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, and Secretary of Defense is that he's essentially picking up where he left off in terms of waging great power competition against China. There were some who thought early on that maybe in the second Trump administration, he would fill the ranks with folks who were more of the isolationist flavor and who might seek to downgrade or maybe even eliminate entirely some of our alliances and partnerships, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but worldwide. And that has not come to pass. What we have seen instead is a clear indication from the president-elect that he plans to continue to reinvigorate the Indo-Pacific strategy. And frankly, you know, the Biden administration carried over the Indo-Pacific strategy from the first Trump administration and did a lot of strengthening alliances and partnerships itself to counter China, right? So, you know, we could talk a lot about in the United States how it's a very polarized situation politically, and it is on most issues, but actually on the Indo-Pacific, the Trump and Biden administrations have been quite consistent in what they're trying to do in this region.
Consistent, so there's continuity, but my question was about whether the Republicans are going to be more hawkish and will want to actually you know, put the money where the mouth is and, you know, deploy more. You're right that, you know, since Obama's time, actually, there is this rebalancing or pivot to Asia, attempt by the US to come into China's backyard and to, like you said, to check its expansionism. But the record is mixed, isn't it? I mean, they've not always been very successful in pushing back. So with Trump coming back, should the Chinese be worried, or do you think that they still believe that they can continue with their salami slicing and continue with their, you know, harassment of smaller countries, which has become a big issue in the region, the Philippines being a classic case? Or do you think that there will be enough deterrence and enough pushback going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still too early to tell, but what I will say in terms of Congress is that there's really bipartisan consensus on the need to counter and compete against China. So the incoming Trump administration definitely has Congress in its corner in terms of passing legislation that is designed to help counter and compete against China. Whether the new Trump administration is able to convince China to restore deterrence, if you will, I think that's the premise of your question, although I would respectfully push back a bit and say deterrence is still has still prevailed, right? Because even in a situation like you know, China vis-a-vis Taiwan, right? China, yes, has been doing salami slicing tactics, has been sending military aircraft into Taiwan's air defense identification zone on a near daily basis, has been doing a variety of other things that worry Taiwan, but there has been no war there. Yeah. When you look at China's dispute with the Philippines over Second Thomas Shoal and Scarborough Shoal and Sabina Shoal, and I mean, you can go on down the line in the South China Sea. Yes, there have been gray zone tactics, but there has been no war, right?
And the mutual invasion, and
the mutual defense treaty between the U.S. and the Philippines is designed to deter, right? And to deter that possibility of war. So I think deterrence has held, but like you say, salami slicing tactics or gray zone tactics, whatever we want to call it, that persists. And it's actually, in my view, it demonstrates how deterrence is succeeding because China doesn't have any other good options but to fire water cannons, to use military-grade lasers, to harass and ram ships in the area, right? And so I don't know that a whole lot of restoring deterrence is necessary, although the incoming Trump administration has talked a lot about Reagan's, you know, peace through strength, right? So I do think we're going to see a significant military buildup over the coming years, regardless of whether we need to do that or not to restore deterrence.
Right. Derek, let's talk about some of the coalitions that the U.S. has been, you know, involved in this region. Of course, there's the Quad, which is India, Japan, and Australia, and that is probably the central, you know, force in the region in many ways to make the Indo-Pacific a reality. But then there is also the so-called Squad, or the East Asian Quad, as some people have called it, without India, but with the treaty allies of the US, the Philippines, Japan, and Australia. And then there is the AUKUS that's also been created with Australia and the UK, a kind of a military alliance. So in all these three, the US is there, it's a main player. And the question is, these, of course, Some have started during Trump, some started during Biden. And will there be more such constructs? And what happens to these constructs themselves? Are they being effective in the waters? I mean, people always ask, okay, you're announcing all these things and you're saying we're building architecture. Everyone is talking about regional architecture. But is this enough to stop China in its tracks, or to make them wary and to alter the Chinese behavior? So what are you seeing in terms of these plurilateral formations or coalitions?
Yeah, I think so. So Trump, the first Trump administration was the administration that resurrected the Quad after a nearly decade-long hiatus, and frankly, a lot of people laughed at it. They thought that, well, Quad 1.0 failed, so why would Quad 2.0 succeed, right? And what we have seen since then is the Quad has steadily risen through the levels of all the governments, right? So going from the director general level up to the foreign minister level, and then ultimately now we see at summit levels, right? And they have met, I believe it's 6 times at the summit level, and so that the Quad has now become a foundational block within the Indo-Pacific, and the Biden administration has continued that momentum. Now, I don't see Trump Part 2 walking away from that, again, because it's something that they helped to resurrect. But I also don't see the new Trump administration doing much in terms of mini-lateral cooperation. That seems to have been more of a Biden administration feature, but there's not really, frankly, evidence one way or another that Trump would continue. I just don't see any evidence right now that he would. And so I'm wondering whether that is going to continue. In terms of your question about the impact on Beijing's thinking, it's really hard to tell. We know that when AUKUS first was unveiled, that Beijing, said that it was yet again another example of the U.S. engaging in a Cold War mentality and a zero-sum game. They were very upset about it. This is designed to contain China, right? But what have they done fundamentally to change their position vis-a-vis the U.S. and its allies and partners? Not a whole lot, if anything. It's hard to really pinpoint anything in particular. So are these working in terms of, again, forcing China to think twice or thrice about what it's doing? It's not clear that they are. But what these mini-laterals do accomplish is they instill confidence in our allies and partners that we are doing something, and we are doing something in concert with them. We are giving them agency. We are giving them the ability to participate. And that, of course, includes India within the context of the Quad.
Right. Derek, so India is not a treaty ally of the US, but we have a comprehensive global and strategic partnership, which has grown cumulatively, and we are doing higher end things in defense, in economics and connectivity, all these things. So technology. Now with Trump coming back, there is the question about the converse side of this, of course, is trade wars and the economic friction with partners and allies, and whether the herd can hold together, and same questions are being asked by the Europeans. They are talking about Trump-proofing their security. So some of the allies perhaps will be also wary about whether the US commitments are credible and whether the US will uphold their guarantees and all that. But India is in a different boat. It's not an ally. So what do you think is the future for the India-US partnership, especially in the defense area? Because we have done a lot of, all the foundational agreements have been signed, and there's a lot of interoperability. The militaries are jointly doing a lot of things together. So at the bilateral level also, because what India and the US will do together will be in many ways the building block for the security in the region, isn't it? So with Trump coming back, generally we have seen that with Republicans there's more of a focus on a geopolitical approach than under the Democrats. So do you expect that this near alliance-like relationship that we are now developing will go further, and how will that be seen by the Chinese? Because the Chinese always say that if India inches closer to the US, it's a problem for us, and then they apply pressure on us. And in India also there's a debate going on as to how far we should go with the US. So how far can we go with the US?
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting that China and India have reached an agreement on their disputed land border, the timing of which was, right before the U.S. presidential election. I'm not saying that that's the primary reason why China decided to deal now, but I think it's a contributing factor, right? Because China doesn't want to see India completely in the embrace of the United States, right? And so one way to try to renormalize the relationship is to deal with the border, right? And so I think that's why in part, why you saw that deal made. Now, in terms of the U.S.-India relationship, it is, in the strongest position it's ever been in, right? And that's and where can it go from here? I mean, if you listen to the leaders, whether it's Biden and Modi or now Trump and Modi, the sky is essentially the limit. And so, I think with Trump coming back into the White House, Trump's a very personalistic leader, really enjoys Modi's company. They had an excellent congratulatory phone call. And so I suspect that relationship is going to continue to soar to new heights. Now, are there things in the longer term, so post-Trump, right? Because Trump is going to, I think, deprioritize a values-based approach. He's not going to talk as much about human rights and democracy and all of those things. He's going to definitely prioritize national interests. I mean, national interests are always a priority, but it's a matter of, what's coming out of U.S. officials' mouths, and sometimes it's values, sometimes it's interests, right? But I think in terms of the Trump administration, it's going to be all about interests, not about values at all. It's going to be very transactional. And I think that's something that India, it's more transparent to India. It's more genuine to India. So I think the relationship will be in good shape over the next 4 years. But after that, it is hard to tell how things are going to go because there's going to be a political transition in the United States. Trump is in his second term. There are, I would say, growing concerns in the United States on certain parts of the U.S.-India relationship. For example, India's continued strategic partnership with Russia in the context of Russia invading and destroying Ukraine. There are concerns on the Indian side as well, that if the U.S. goes ahead and tries to reset its ties with Pakistan, that's going to have an impact on the U.S.'s relationship with India. And by the way, the Biden administration, now on the way out, but the Biden administration was quietly and incrementally trying to do just that, to reset the Pakistan relationships.
You're right. I think there is some fragility, but good friends, we always tend to sometimes agree to disagree also on some points. But talking of geopolitical coordination, I mean, this is where, for example, in the case of Bangladesh, we found that India and the United States were on two different pages, with the previous regime. And when the regime fell, many in India were actually blaming the US,
Yeah.
So we would have liked, the Bay of Bengal region is very much part of the Indo-Pacific, there's the western end of the Indo-Pacific. And we would very much want, that we are working on the same page, because to face the Chinese challenge, we should have a closer understanding, right? So there are some such, you mentioned Pakistan, there, even Afghanistan, the way the Biden administration withdrew from in a haste. Indians were very upset about it, and they thought that we are going to bear the brunt of the terror that's now going to emanate because the Americans have packed up their bags and left. So that fear of abandonment or kind of a callousness or whatever you want to call it by the US, because it's a big power and sometimes they are juggling this theater with that theater, and sometimes they have to reposition into the Middle East because the Israel and Iran are fighting a war, So it looks like, so again, to come back to the main question, how can we improve coordination and understanding between the US and India, where especially in the Indo-Pacific, where it looks like China could encroach, we should be closing ranks, right? And there should be no daylight between us, ideally. And so how do you think we can overcome these gaps?
Well, I mean, I think what we are doing right now is exactly what we should be doing, constantly having conversations about all of the things that we agree on and disagree on. I mean, of course, we have the 2+2 dialogue. So, secretaries of state and defense meeting with your external affairs minister and your defense minister, right? those types of conversations, they didn't happen years ago, and they're happening now, right? And my understanding in talking to Indian interlocutors here in New Delhi is that these conversations have been absolutely invaluable to the relationship. And so, and on the American side, when I talk to folks throughout the U.S. government, they say the same thing, right? And so I think that type of activity needs to continue. And in terms of closing ranks on China, I mean, I think we've closed ranks as much as maybe is possible at this point, right? Because of course, India is still non-aligned or multi-aligned, right, to preserve its strategic autonomy. And forging an alliance with the United States is just simply something that India wouldn't do unless there was a real reason to do it, such as a Chinese attack on India, right? Beyond what we saw in Galwan Valley, as brutal as that was and as terrible as that was, we need to see obviously something more large scale than that. And so, I don't expect an alliance, but then again, I'm not sure that we need an alliance necessarily because we're already on the same page in terms of the common threat. Sometimes the thing that I worry about, and it's not just in the India case, but in other cases, for example, our relationship with Vietnam, which has now also been upgraded to comprehensive strategic partnership, highest level of partnership you can have with Vietnam. One of the things I worry about is if it's too focused on the China threat, what if the U.S. and China all of a sudden get along? Or what if, Vietnam and China have a better relationship than they have now? Or India and China have a better relationship? If you take China out of it, right, then can the bilateral relationships stand on their own? I think in the case of the U.S. and India, absolutely.
Yeah, we got trade, investment, technology, diaspora.
There's so many other things. I mean, the joint statement between Biden and Modi in 2023, when Modi came to the White House, I mean, you saw the depth and breadth of different things that our two countries are working on. And a lot of them don't have anything to do with China at all. Right. So that's encouraging. Yeah.
So in other words, too narrow a focus on China can also be a weakness, and that's a point well taken. Okay, Derek, last point. We have these partnerships and that during Biden administration, they called it the lattice work strategy and all that. Going forward, we expect this architecture to continue building despite potential frictions on trade and other things with Trump. In the long run, can we create this free and open? I mean, it's like I'm asking you a rhetorical question. Free and open means that one where China is under check and where, there is a red line which they cannot cross. And what we are seeing is that the kind of shipbuilding they're doing, the kind of fastest naval buildup. So on the other hand, Australia is doing its own buildup. Japan is doing. We have to ramp up our defense production too. So as an analyst looking into the future, let's say 10 years down the line, you think we would have realized the ideals and the values of an Indo-Pacific, which is, free, open, and also balanced, where there is no hegemony of China? I mean, that's something, are we all working towards that goal, or do you foresee any hiccups or, that we may lose the plot somewhere?
Well, I think that, it's not just the U.S.'s relationship with India being at an all-time high. It's also, you can look across the Indo-Pacific, whether it's Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Australia, increasingly New Zealand. I mean, the list goes on of countries that understand that China is not their friend, okay, not necessarily their enemy either, but at a minimum, a competitor in the region and a country that seeks to undermine or even overturn the rules-based order within the Indo-Pacific. And when the Trump administration called China a revisionist country, revisionism essentially means that they are unhappy with the way the international system is. They're aggrieved by it, and they seek to recoup their losses. And in this case, it's territorial losses, such as, from their perspective, such as losing Taiwan or, recouping losses within that 9-dash line in the South China Sea. And so I think there's a lot of agreement on that. There's different levels of effort in terms of contributing to the Indo-Pacific strategy, right? But I guess the thing that I worry about, and I don't mean to leave us on a down note, is that, a lot of this rivalry or this rivalrous behavior, it's simply not good in terms of maintaining peace and stability in the region. Because as much as we don't want war, and we think the Chinese don't want war either, the more we tail each other in the South China Sea, the more we kind of our militaries get within close proximity of each other. There's always a chance for miscalculation resulting in an accident, all right, and then escalation from there. And let's not forget that China and the U.S. And India, are all nuclear-armed countries, right? And so I have some serious reservations about the longer-term implications of engaging in a strategy that puts China in a corner. Right, because it's only natural for a country that's put in a corner to try to lash out against that reality.
So I hope we are ready for crisis also, given what you're talking about, inadvertently, if there's a spiral, I hope the Indo-Pacific countries, the partners, the allies, we are all ready for a crisis and for contingencies, because that is really going to be the acid test going forward during Trump and beyond. So viewers, this fascinating conversation with Derek Grossman. What we are learning is that there are a lot of variables out there, and the central rivalry between China and the US will remain. It is likely to hot up, but there will be some guardrails and restraints, because the great powers don't go to direct wars with each other. But what happens to smaller countries who are in between in the region? They are mostly taking sides. They all want to preserve their sovereignty and autonomy, but some are also bandwagoning, as the word goes, towards China. And the real question is, what will happen to the overall balance? And for that, India and the United States have to work closely in coordination and reduce the differences that they have, and to the extent possible, align with many other like-minded partners and keep the coalitions going, because without that multilateral approach, we may struggle in the long run to make the regional order free, open, and democratic with the balance of power. Let me thank Derek Grossman for valuable insights. It's great having you, and please continue the work advocating for India and being a friend of India, Derek.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Viewers, Indo-Pacific security is work in progress. It's a lot of hard work, and a lot of the close strategic partnerships and alliances that make up this region have to remain strong if at all we are to beat back the Chinese challenge. And India is up to the task, but India is also calibrating its own approach towards China, given all the shifts in the global order. So it's going to be a very complex but absolutely riveting drama out there in the Indo-Pacific. Let's keep our eyes open and wide open to see this drama and as it unfolds. Let's study this region and let's continue to focus on the developments there. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.